Hey, we are out here in Tromsø, Norway. You hear me? Testing out the new LUMIX S1R Mark II. I know what all of y'all gonna say. Oh, you shouldn't be going on press trips and you're only saying good stuff about the camera because you're in Norway. No, shut up. This is actually a solid camera. You're gonna find out in this video. Let's go. So I decided, instead of trying to cram this whole video into 2 days in Norway when I had just got the camera, that I was gonna come home and make this video instead, because there's just so much to unpack with this S1R Mark II. So a few housekeeping items first, if you will, before we get started with this video. A, I did not script this video, so expect some mess ups, etc. I do have notes because there's so much to talk about. B, LUMIX did not pay me to make this video, nor did they get to see it. They did fly us out to Norway and give us the cameras. You haters can be mad about it all you want to. It was a great freaking time. I wish we were there longer, but we only had 2 days with the camera. With that said, they don't get to review the video. They didn't pay me, no money exchange hands. I'm gonna tell y'all anything I want to about this camera. And the last thing I want to say is I think we need to remember price point. And I hate when people say this. I hate when people be like, for the price, okay? But it's something that we really need to make a point with this camera. This camera is $3,299. It's not cheap, but for the money, you cannot get a more complete camera on the market so far up to this point. And this is the S1R Mark II. LUMIX hasn't come out with the S1H Mark II yet. We know that's coming probably soon. And after you hear what this camera can do, you're gonna be like, what on earth do they have left to throw at the S1H? Now, what is the S1R Mark II? Let's go ahead and go over the key specs. This is a new I shouldn't say new. This is a new to LUMIX 44 megapixel sensor. I have very strong inklings that it's the same freaking sensor that's out of the Ronin 4D 8K, 8.1K up to 30 frames per second in 10-bit. LUMIX says that this camera can achieve 14 stops of usable dynamic range. I don't know if that is true. You'll have to go watch freaking Gerald's video and his freaking Xyla 21 to really see the results of that, but LUMIX says 14 stops. 6.4 open gate up to 30 frames per second. LUMIX also says that we will be getting 8.1 and 7.2K open gate, again in 10-bit. Internal on the S1R Mark II in a firmware update. 5.8K ProRes RAW HQ, again internally, and you could also do it to SSD if you want to. It could also record simultaneous proxy files. It could also do 8.1K RAW over HDMI, but no recorder support that yet, but the capability is there. 4K 120 with a very slight crop, 4K 60 with no crop, 32-bit flow internal audio recording using the XLR2, 8 stops of stabilization with the new croplet stabilization mode that I'm going to show you. Now, when it comes to photography, 44 megapixel stills, 40 frames per second burst in electronic, 10 frames per second burst in mechanical, up to 1.5 second pre-capture, pre-shooting, whatever you want to call it. I think LUMIX calls it pre-shooting. The last thing before I move on is, remember, the camera has LUMIX Lab in it, okay? And I don't know if you've ever used LUMIX Lab and LUMIX cameras, but it has revolutionized the game when it comes to how a camera and phone should be able to talk to each other, transfer photos, data. You can put 39 real-time LUTs in the camera, record those to video and photo, and if you want to, you can, create new LUTs. You can customize your LUTs, you can share it with other people, you can download new ones from LUMIX Lab and seamlessly just transfer them back and forth to your phone. And it has LUMIX Flow, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, when it comes to body and design, I did bring the S5 IIX into the party just to show you how they got rid of that huge freaking body from the original S1R. So the S1R Mark II is just a tad bigger than the S5 IIX. As you see, if I go ahead and line these up for you, it's not a whole lot bigger. It's really not. It's about the same size, but they did some major updates to the body. So the first thing, as you see on the front, the shutter is closed because the camera is off. That was not possible with the S5 IIX. This is some type of new carbon composite material that they're using for the shutter mechanism. Also, you'll see that there is a front record button, which is hugely freaking useful. On the top, as you see, it looks very similar to the S5 IIX. The display from the S1R is gone, but we do have locking dials, which is a plus. Now on the other dial, we do have a photo, video, SQ switch, which is a huge addition. I'm so glad LUMIX is putting this in cameras now. On the back, we have a 5.76 million EVF that does go up to 120 frames a second. There is a lock switch on here, which I didn't notice until we were about to leave Norway. you can actually program any function you want to this lock switch. So example, you want the touch screen to be locked, or you want the rear jog dial to be locked and the white balance button to be locked for whatever reason. Well, you can customize those in the menu, and once you flip the lock switch on, it only locks those certain features. The 4-way flippy screen has made its way back into LUMIX cameras, so it can do tabletop or it can do vlog styles, 1.8 million dots, and we now have a CF Express Type B slot on the side as well as an SD card slot. And then on the left hand side you have your typical full-size HDMI port, USB-C port, headphone and microphone jacks. Now this USB-C port does not support this camera being a USB webcam, which I feel like is a huge miss for LUMIX, a huge miss. Every camera these days basically has the ability to plug up a freaking USB cable and use it as a high quality webcam, and I just can't understand why LUMIX would not include that in this body. It's made out of magnesium alloy, plastic, and all that other good stuff. I was using it in Norway in the rain and the snow, freezing cold temperatures with no problem. So another very solid body from LUMIX. I love the red and black color scheme. I just love the way this thing looks and the way it feels. Now, the first thing I do want to touch on is photography. This camera was a complete joy to use in Norway, and since I've had it back at home, 44 megapixels is a lot of data to work with. It's kind of like the sweet spot. It's not too many megapixels. And obviously you can go in there and pick the different sizes that you want. This does have a new 177 megapixel high res mode, built-in tethering ability to capture one, which is fire for studio photographers. Of course, it's got live view composite just like LUMIX's other cameras, and multiple exposure mode has made a comeback. The files out of this camera, just like any other LUMIX camera, are beautiful. There's a ton of dynamic range for you to work with, and again, you have LUMIX Lab if you want to, you know, take your shooting experience even further. One thing I do want to note real quick is this 44 megapixel sensor is not a stack sensor. It's a traditional CMOS sensor, which means it's not really built for speed. With that being said, the camera can shoot 40 frames per second in electronic, 10 frames per second mechanical, but that's really nothing to talk about. Let's go back to 40. Why else would you use 40 frames per second electronic? To capture fast moving subjects, right? Well, the issue with sensors of higher megapixels that aren't speed based is a lot of times when you put those faster frame rates in there, the readout can't keep up with those frame rates. So you'll see with these pictures of the mug on the table, as soon as you start to move the camera while you're doing a 40 frames per second burst, you automatically start to notice that there's warping in there because the readout can't keep up with the frame rate. So it's very strange to me why camera companies put these faster burst rates in there if the sensors can't keep up with it, because I won't use this for electronic burst shooting because of the warping due to the slower readout speed. But can you do it? Sure, you can do it. Now, real quick, I want to say if you like this video so far, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you get notified when new videos go up. There will be a lot of follow-up videos on this camera, so make sure you are subbed up. Now, let's move on to video, where there is an absolute freaking dizzying array of frame rates, resolutions, codecs, aspect ratios. I would never use them all, to be honest with y'all, but I do like that all of these options are there for the different types of shooters out there. There's something in there literally for everybody. But I think talking about image quality is pretty moot at this point. All of these newer cameras, the image looks fantastic, and this camera is no exception. You got plenty of dynamic range in here. We're going to talk about that in 1 second. You got vlog, you got real-time, you got all of that stuff. This camera does have false color also, which I didn't mention before. Now, remember I kind of told you earlier in this video that I strongly believe that this is the same sensor out of the Ronin 4D 8K. Well, let me tell you why. So the Ronin 4D 8K will allow you to pick whether you prefer dynamic range at the cost of poor roll and shutter performance, or would you prefer less dynamic range to get an advantage in the roll and shutter department? Well, this camera is the same way, and it's called dynamic range expansion. Now, with that said, turn the dynamic range expansion off. You will lose about a stop of sensitivity in exchange for better roll and shutter performance, and it does get better. When you turn dynamic range expansion on, you get that stop back, but the roll and shutter performance in just about every mode, I mean, it's way more noticeable. With that said, this does have dual base ISOs, and I need to refer to my handy dandy note sheet to tell you what those are because it gets confusing. In vlog dynamic range expansion on, you get base ISOs of 400 and 2000. If you turn dynamic range expansion off, it's 2000 and 1000. For all of your cine-like profiles, your dual base is 160 and 800, and HLG is 320, 1600. Anything else is 800, 400. I do want to be honest about the autofocus system, and keep in mind that these cameras are still pre-released. Lumix has already given us a firmware update. I'm sure there will be more, just like they do with all of their cameras before camera launch. It does have 779-point phase detect autofocus. It does your detection of planes, trains, freaking automobiles, roaches, aliens, all that stuff. You do have to still pick the subject type. It doesn't do it automatically. And the option to pick certain parts of the subject, like if you want to prioritize face or eyes or whatever, it's still there, and that's dope. Under normal circumstances, the S1R Mark II does fine for photo and video when it comes to autofocus. However, when I compare it to like my Sony cameras, which I always use, and they're not the sports cameras, these are just the normal like ZV-E1, A7R5. When you compare it to those cameras, I find that under challenging situations such as shooting sports, where there's a lot of people, a lot of things going on, or lower light situations, unfortunately, the S1R Mark II in its current state still cannot hold the candle to my Sony cameras under the same circumstances, right? And I've gone through, I know Lumix autofocus systems work differently. I've gone through the menus, customized it, tweaked it, all that other good stuff, and I just can't get it to be reliable or as intelligent as Sony cameras. Am I saying it's bad? Absolutely not. However, I do have to be honest when it comes to, is it as good as Sony? It's still not there yet. Now, the next thing you'll want to know is, do I lose subject tracking if I connect the external monitor? And that answer is yes and no. So in 8K, you can forget about it. Autofocus still works, but there's no subject recognition or tracking. At 6.4K open gate, it still works up to 30 frames a second. However, when you switch over to 5.9K, 24 frames a second, you do have it, but once you go to 60 frames a second, you don't have it. Now, once you switch over to 5.8K, you do get it back, but once you switch over to 5.8K, 60 frames a second, you lose it. So it really just depends on the frame rate and resolution combo when you have an external monitor connected. Some modes work, some modes don't. Overheating. This does have a built-in fan. Personally, I have not been able to get this camera to overheat, but I'm also not filming super long multi-hour videos, okay? I use this for a couple of my YouTube videos, shooting at 6K open gate, didn't have any problems. I mean, it ran for what, 45, 50 minutes, no overheat warnings or anything like that. However, I do know people who have used this for longer dock style work, and some of them did report using like 5.9K at 60 frames a second for about an hour. They did experience some overheating. So I think if you want the official overheating test, you'll probably have to go watch, again, Gerald or something like that. But I think for typical video content, you won't have a problem. The main issue you'll run into with any overheating is if you're in a warmer environment and you are using these higher frame rates that involve a lot of data moving, a lot of oversampling. You could run into it in those situations. I personally have not run into any overheating with this camera at all. Now, I'm gonna be honest, the Lumix S1R Mark II has the best stabilization I've ever used in the camera. It's even better than the Sony A7RV, which is also one of the best out there. 8 stops of stabilization inside the camera. Of course, you got your typical suite of stabilization stuff. So you got like boost in there to give you like those tripod style locked off shots. You got anamorphic stabilization, but this has something new called cropless stabilization. And basically what it does is some type of wizardry way. It takes the edges of the frame that aren't being used on wider lenses and somehow uses that to stabilize the corners and get rid of all of the warping. 18 millimeters usually is a problem on Lumix cameras. As you see in this clip right here, there's no warping or anything on the edges. I don't know how they're doing it, but it freaking works amazing. One other thing I want to cover before we wrap this video up, and that is the Lumix Flow app that's launching alongside the S1R Mark II. So it's a free app. You'll be able to like shot plan and script and all that stuff on there, which personally, I'm not going to use that stuff. However, you can also use it, as I mentioned earlier in this video, to monitor your S1R Mark II. And it is a full-fledged monitoring app. You can change the settings of the camera and everything right from your phone, which is fire. I'm really excited for this app because I don't want to have to carry around a freaking monitor all the time. Sometimes I would just like to pull out my phone and just fire it right up and monitor my screen if I need to. I'm hyped about where this app is gonna go, and I'm sure it'll be on all Lumix cameras in a little while. All right, I don't wanna go on and on with this. I'm gonna make more videos on the S1R Mark II. I'm gonna go back to my original statement at the beginning of this video. I think for the money, this camera cannot be beat. And not even just for the money, like this is a very, very capable photo and video camera. Are there other cameras out there that might be able to beat it? and rolling shutter or resolution, whatever. Sure, but as a whole package by itself for $32.99, again, remember, you're also getting real-time LUT on top of that. No other camera in any ecosystem can give you that besides Lumix cameras. For $32.99, you will be hard-pressed to find, you can't find a camera this powerful, this complete when it comes to photo and video at the price of $3,299. Again, is it perfect? Absolutely not. I think this camera needs another firmware or two before it's really, really good, which just like we talked about earlier in this video, Lumix has a track record of keeping up with their firmware updates and supporting their cameras and, you know, fixing the issues. So I have no doubt in my mind, especially with this being one of their flagship cameras, that they won't do the same thing. They absolutely will. And remember, there's still a S1H out there in the wild somewhere that we need an update on. So if this is what we got with the S1R, imagine what the S1H Mark II is gonna bring. Anyways, I'm hyped about this camera. This is one of the first cameras in a long time that I'm actually hyped about because it pushes the envelope for the price and nobody else is willing to do that. And here we are with the LUMIX S1R Mark II. And this is what they're doing. So hope y'all enjoyed this video. I know it was all over the place. I didn't script it, I didn't plan it, you know, it is what it is. I'm very curious to know what y'all think. Down in the comment section, let me know. And until next time, I'm out of here. Tight shirt, Terry Warfield. Peace and chicken grease. I'm out, y'all. Much love. Peace.